At this point, you should have read section 15.6, copying. It talks about some of the problems that aliasing can create. And then it talks about the difference between a shallow and a deep copy. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at one of the problems with the shallow copy, and then we're going to write a new version of move rectangle that actually does a copy and move instead of just moving the original rectangle. And we'll see how that deep copy gets used. So here's the code that we have so far. The import, the point, the rectangle, our original move rectangle. And then we see that when we make a copy using the shallow copy and then try to move the shallow copy, it's also going to affect the original box instance. So let's walk that through the visualizer. And we can see that we can create instance references, we initialize our box. That's all like we've seen before. But now notice when we do the shallow copy, we want to create a new object, which it does, but it only makes copies at the top level. Notice that because this is an instance, the copy actually just copies a reference to that point, that corner point, which is going to cause us problems when we call the move rectangle function, because when it tries to change the x on box 2, it's inadvertently changing the x on box 1 and the y. So we end up with two different objects, but one of them isn't quite right. So let's see how we can fix that with a deep copy. So now, what we're going to actually do is we're going to change the code. So instead of just move rectangle, it would be more correct to call it copy and move rectangle. But we will go ahead and actually create a new rectangle by making a deep copy of the original rectangle that was passed to us. And then we will change the corners of the new rectangle. And what's the last thing we've got to do? We got to return that new rectangle. And then we'll refactor our code to change it so that instead of box 2 being set to a copy and then moving the rectangle, we will now use our new improved copy and move to call move rectangle on box to generate our next box, our box 2 value. Let's walk that through the visualizer. And the first few bits are the same as before. But now notice what happens when we call move rectangle here. Sets up the new frame, and it starts off with box and rect both aliasing the same alias, but they're both referencing the same instance. But notice what happens when we do a deep copy to create the next instance of rect2. Notice here, it's actually created a completely new point instance. So it's separate. So now when we go and edit, update those values, it's only changing rect2. It's not changing the original rectangle. Last thing we got to do, of course, is return. And it returns a value, which is simply a reference to the new rectangle that we created. That gets returned and ultimately assigned, box 2 is assigned that reference. So we can see that using the deep copy, we can actually avoid the problem that the shallow copy caused us.